Welcome to this session of Speak Your Mind by Climb Mobilize. My guest for this session is Rhona Morrell from iRegen. Hello, Rhona.
Hey Ian, how are you? Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to the session.
That's great. So am I. Thank you so much for joining us. And Rhona is going to be speaking with us today about the question of how to drive policy and systems change at scale while protecting individual rights from government overreach. And Rhona, this is really interesting. And I'd like to start off with a question, if I may, which is, what do you think is the biggest blocker to driving policy and systems change for people and planet today?
Wow, big question there. No, and a great one. And I think it's probably a great place really to start with all of this. And it's certainly been a journey for me in the last 7 years. I think there are two things really here that drive it, and that's fear and funds. So the two F's. But yeah, I think there's a huge lack of interconnected and interdisciplinary thinking here across the public sector, the private sector, NGOs. And alongside that, there's also, it's a bit like a new brand or a new product. Everyone's in kind of that research investigative mode. So you've got loads of people out there who are on the bandwagon. You've got loads of people who know they've got to do stuff, but they don't quite know what to do. And then you've got lots of people equally who don't want change. So will be driving content and misinformation, etc., to kind of maybe put a lot of fear into what you're thinking or what you want to do, or knock you for six and go, God, I really believed in that. But now actually, so for example, let's say wind, you think wind will be amazing in terms of energy, but you've really got to drive under the surface. So I think where we have a big challenge is you've got the far left, if you like, going, wind would be amazing, brings in the energy, it's a free resource. And then you've got the extreme opposite going, absolutely not. What if it's not windy, offshore? And then in the middle, you've got, what about the seabirds? What about the impact to migrating animals and whales? What happens when you destroy the seabed at deep levels? So this is the journey that I've found through everything. And that's just one small example, but essentially, um, it's not having that interconnected understanding and thinking and the honesty to be able to say, well, that sounds good on paper, but let's just drill down on that a little bit. What do we need to make wind turbines, for example? And so I think when you dig deep into all things climate change, where I've netted out now is actually it's about systems change. And I think we need to take that one step further back, because most of the time, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, what that is a perfect scorecard of everything that's wrong, and so it's a bit of an eye opener that goes, wow, we really haven't nailed this, have we? And this isn't just a developed versus developing, or kind of global south or global north. Those terms in their own right are ridiculously um you know mirrored, in the sense that there are a trillion things in between. So I think a lot of the way it's talked about, either from climate alarmism or right through to lobbying against misinformation, what we really need is some really smart objectives. So for every COP that's ever been, have you ever had a rundown of the objectives? Were they smart? Who was responsible? Where did we achieve? Where didn't we? And what's the progression been? For anyone who's worked in the corporate world, if you want your salary and you want your bonus, that's exactly what you had to do. You had to write your KPIs, and whether you're the CEO or an individual, those things were critically important. So I think so much to unpick there, but within just a small couple of minutes, I think recognizing that it's about systems change and not just climate you know gets people to think about heat and weather, whereas actually what we're not looking at is inequality, technology, infrastructure, all of these things. There's so much in here that our forms of media and communication are very one-way stream. But for me, it's really about driving fear, also the money. It's going to cost too much money, or we haven't got enough money. Let me just point one simple fact out. Last year, globally, we spent $2.24 trillion on arming for war. Now, when we say we haven't got money, we have got money to do these things. What we've done within the world of media, and also be that platforms, like LinkedIn or Facebook, is that we've got this kind of fight or flight about what information is real and what information isn't. Then you get to the point where you're like, well, I just don't know what to believe. So therefore, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. It's much easier. My world's not falling apart right now. I don't have to worry about it. So I would say those are the biggest blockers at the moment. And we'll come on to some other big areas around where the power lies. If you follow the money, if you follow the resources, and what I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit more.
Thanks. That's very interesting. So recognizing that those are the blockers, how do you then think that governments can then drive change at scale for the people that they're supposed to be protecting?
Yeah, I think the end of that sentence is really, really critical, because sometimes you think, we've all experienced recently the impacts to the cost of our living and energy. So take, for example, I'm here in the UK, and our prices have gone through the roof, and everyone, we hear the rhetoric that it's about energy security. Well, we only get 5% of what we need anyway from Russia. And then on the other side of that, we see the billions that are being made from these companies, that it just doesn't make sense to people anymore. What we're hearing versus what we're seeing are two different things. And so it's that kind of age old, well, I'm going to tell you one thing, but I'm going to do exactly the opposite. And I think that's driven such a huge amount of distrust. So if we can, I think last year in Europe, I think it was around $123 billion were in subsidies just for energy. Like this isn't pharmaceuticals, this isn't agriculture, this is just for energy. And so if they're going to put their money where their mouth is, then why hasn't that shift changed? I'm not talking about the euphoric, oh, this world's going to be a wonderful place, but actually, what if we put 123 billion into green energy, or renewable energy, should I say? Because another thing I'd like to make really clear is we've got to be honest about the materials of this energy. You can't, these materials come from somewhere, and they come from the earth, they come from the ground. So lithium batteries, the wind turbines themselves, the solar panels. And let's not forget that actually, without any legislation, all the government stepping in and providing the right subsidies to the right industries, and by actually being honest with themselves, they are using the platform that they don't want to take over people's lives, and they don't want to determine. We had the famous speech recently, Rishi Sunak going, we're all in a cost of living crisis, and I don't want to be putting more pressure, and if we go too green, that'll cost people more money. That is fundamentally a lie. And there are many, many things that could be done to help the transition. Okay. I firmly believe we cannot turn the tap off to oil and gas tomorrow. Okay. There has to be a transition period. But if governments don't step up and make it legislative and put in the governance, people aren't going to do it. It's a bit like me telling my kids, right, I'm not actually going to punish you if you don't do X, Y, and Z, or there won't be consequences to those actions. They're not going to change their behavior. And so, because that's then not brought in, the big players aren't going to change. And we as consumers or clients or customers, whatever way you want to look at us, our choices are then minimized. And so, yes, the costs become too high. So I think that's the first thing that they could do. Secondly, I think the subsidies in the private sector incentives need to be there. We cannot do this without the private sector. And so that's really, really important that we provide them with the incentives to be able to retrofit homes and houses, to be able to provide them the opportunity to earn an income. There's a difference between earning an income and a living wage versus making billions for the very small amount of people. I think there needs to be some clear transitional objectives for certain industries. Stop saying we're going all electric cars and then pulling back on that 2 years later. How can you forward plan if you're in the car industry on a 10, 15, 20-year roadmap if the government, because they work in 4-year cycles, are just going to cut that short? And so if you're the CEO of any industry, you're not really going to be thinking much longer than a 4-year cycle, because that's the standard. So there needs to be that interpolitical agreement about what happens. Now, geez, that sounds completely unrealistic, doesn't it? But that's the reality. People can't continuously work on a 4-year cycle. I also think there's a real dollop of honesty here around admitting that pure economic growth, year on year on year on year, is not the answer. I mean, we've been saying it here in England. We haven't moved for the last 40 years. Not, and certainly nothing since the financial crash. The odd percentage here, and what it's pointless. There's always a point where it becomes, how much more do you want? How much more can you keep going, when actually year on year you're failing on those objectives and those things that you say are happening, and we're not being honest with people about it. I think there needs to be a recognition and a transition towards adopting a well-being model. Let's be honest. Let's look at all the rich countries in the world, for example. We look at them and we think, wow, education, healthcare, access to homes. With I'm privileged to be sat here in a home with a roof over my head. But actually, we've got the biggest suicide rates, high levels of anxiety, depression, the number of medical issues there are globally for countries that are more well off is quite shocking. Increased risks of cancers, heart attacks, all of these things. It doesn't seem that this constant drive for economic growth is really working out for either sides, because on the absolute opposite extreme, where we've had the benefit of energy transitions and our economies to grow, they, on the other hand, are being kept at arm's length. So who is this growth actually working for? And that's the thing that I guess that I'm really struggling. I've read books like Limits to Growth and How the World Really Works, Bright Green Lies, David Attenborough books. I have gone to people who are complete deniers of climate and systems change, just to really understand and get under the skin. So I think governments are now realizing that the voice is getting louder. It's the next gen bringing it along, as well as people of my age and older who are going, oh, do you know what? This isn't right. Enough's enough. I'm working my entire life. And then when I come out of it, I'm in a system that's completely broke. So I would really welcome the listeners or anyone kind of tuning in to really talk about systems that are working really well. I'd love to hear about systems that are working really well, but let's be honest about the ones that aren't. And let's have a look at what a well-being economic model could look like. And for all of those who have got their sick bag out and are now throwing up going, whatever, Rhona, I think, what would be so wrong in giving it a try? I know people say if the model, if it's not broke, don't, if it's not broken, don't try and fix it. Well, we know it's broken. So let's give it a go with something else, yeah? Anyway, that's just a few things I think from a government point of view. I think legislation, governance, subsidies, private sector incentives, transitional objectives with clear accountabilities, and kind of this movement into the well-being economy.
Right. That's really interesting. You touched on so many different topics there, from elements of degrowth and, of course, well-being economy, the role of government you've talked about there, and your observation about captains of industry planning for 4-year cycles, because that's what the electoral cycle is. That's particularly interesting. So then the question becomes, should governments, or are governments necessarily the best driver for these longer term goals, such as protecting biodiversity, and climate adaptation legislation that requires this consistency, over longer periods? If you'd like to talk about that, and also, maybe focusing in on one hand, if we need government to push these things for the reasons that you mentioned, but on the other hand, the tendency of power to maybe usurp more power then people may feel more comfortable with. So if you'd like to take a shot at any of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it, about power. We live, or I live in a so-called democracy, um, and many countries do. I think I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm like, is it going to take mass disobedience from, civil society for anything to really, really change? I think the British can be very polite about things, and we tend to queue and, oh, that's really not fair. We like to moan, but we don't quite like to do anything. The French will go out and go mental. You're not putting my pension age up. I think there is a place for governments. I think there is an absolute need to protect democracy. I think what's important is that the powers are leveraged equally. The governments need to step up because the private sector either won't or can't. And actually, I'm not so sure putting the power into the private sector is going to do us any good, because I think from a financial point of view, the core driver of that is, of course, always going to be financial, economic, and for stakeholders. So I think it's important that we have democratically elected governments. I think what needs and must have to change is that these so-called leaders need to be proving that they are working for the majority and for the people, not for, and I'm sure anyone listening to this around the world will be able to resonate with this, but here in the UK, the couple that got the contract for the PPE have just now admitted, oh yes, we did know, and we made 60 million from it, and everyone's in uproar. But actually, what's going to happen? Who's going to are they going to have to pay that 60 million back? Is Rishi Sunak, who or Michael Gove, who gave the contract, going to be punished? The reality is no, and this happens all the time. The financial waste, the lack of accountability, and so I think in some ways, trying to get them even to look at climate adaptation and to even look at the value of natural capital feels far outreached to be able to get them to that space when they can't get the brilliant basics in place already. They can't even do what it is they're supposed to do. And then when you see them, uh, in the House of Commons, literally having a go at each other, it's embarrassing. It's actually, oh my God, these people are representing us. And I only ever see two sides. I see a red one and a blue one. What about all the others? There are representatives of different parties. And so I think we talk a good talk, and they know how to talk a good talk. They are media trained. They know how to avoid answering a question, and they know how to just keep peddling the one that they want to come across. Everyone sees it and everyone can see through it. So I probably just shot myself in the foot there. Our government's the right place to bring this legislation. Sadly, at the minute, that's the only choice we have got. You've got a few really brave, bold private sector companies who are taking leaps and bounds in the sector, even under circumstances where they are heavily chastised for actions, whether that be greenwashing or pollution, waste, all of these things. And then you've got some really cool brands and new partnerships that are coming up from the ground, driving innovation and climate into their products and services. So, in terms of the government, they have the power, they have the data, they have the knowledge. So why aren't they doing it? That's the thing for me. They now need to step up and stop the infighting. They could be here demanding that London transitions and looks at Singapore as a smart city. Instead of building new houses because we've got a housing shortage, fine, build them, but build them so that they have the right credentials around heat source, solar. But guess what? We know why they're not doing it, because the reality is if we all were able to go off grid, who's not going to make money? And then if those people aren't going to make money, who's going to fund the future pensions? And again, they start to put the fear factor in. So it's about stripping all of that back and just being honest. I would dearly love to put solar on my house and have a little wind turbine, but I can't go off grid. I'm locked into these kind of systems and prices and economic models that don't work for the environment and they don't work for me. And I think when you scratch the surface, that's the key element.
That's really interesting. Again, there's so much there, and unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all of it. But it seems like you're talking about the need for these discussions about truths, these core essential truths that need to be discussed, and these honest debates that need to be held, whether it's at schools where the next generation of leadership is being, is growing and developing, or whether it's already in the boardrooms. You mentioned the role of corporate responsibility and leadership, and of course with government. So what are these truths? Where do we discuss them? How do we even begin to tackle that?
Oh God, it's $1 million question, is it? But you know what? I don't think we need to overcomplicate. It's just about having these conversations. It's about being honest. When I first started my journey, I was very much right. My next car is going to be electric, and then I kind of really delved and I went, actually, we don't need 8 billion electric vehicles. What we need is better infrastructure. We need trams, we need trains, we need buses to run on electricity. We need, back in the old days in my village, there was a local train station, and I could get everything locally. And yes, before anyone screams at the TV, we don't want to go back to the old days. It's not about that. Like, we have enough advanced technology and innovation, but it's arming yourself with that information. And we also know that the planet doesn't have enough raw materials in it to make 8 billion flipping electric vehicles. So it's really, that's there to keep the car industry going, right? That's the reality of it. So what can I do at home? Then you've got things like, on the absolute opposite extreme, let's talk about poo. Let's talk about the power of whale poo and phytoplankton, how incredibly important it is to our ocean. We are 70% blue at the end of the day, not only as a planet, but actually as human beings, we are 70% water. So I think having chats around global inequality and poverty, we touched on it earlier, but why are countries like Southeast Asia and Africa in the conditions that they're in? It is not because they are poor countries. They are hugely energetic, wealthy, full of resources. There are questions and serious answers to be answered there around the history of capitalism, the history of slavery, the history of colonialism. And those are things that we can't shy away from. I am British and probably from one of the countries that has historically used and abused nations all over the world, right? But it's about being honest about that and how we don't repeat that. So we can't go from taking coal from them now to taking all the raw materials for lithium batteries and a green energy. If anyone's read Cobalt Red, that's quite a good one to have a read and just to kind of open your eyes. Then we've got things like carbon tunnel vision. It's all we talk about. That's all anyone bloody talks about. What about fertilizers? What about plastics? What about waste? What about biodiversity loss? We have to change the narrative and talk about all of these things as well, because we are interconnected. Then there's the euphoria of the green movement, and we'll sell this beautiful world, and there's kind of this hardcore beliefs, and we're hippies and all of that. Actually, the reality is, if you strip it all back, what we're really sort of talking about is a fairer, more equitable world where everyone can have a living wage. They've talked about things like every human having a global living wage annually of 15, I think it's 15 or 20,000 US dollars. There are some countries like Canada, for example, that charge businesses that use raw materials that are free and then sell them for profit. They have to give the local population an annual income. Okay, so there are systems out there that are working. I think Ireland's just made a move to put nature on the table in terms of politically and also on the board. Then we have to look at things like petroleum. It makes 6,000 products. So we can all sit here and go, we're going to turn the fossil fuels off and we're going to turn gas and oil off. Okay, then let's go have a look at those 6,000 materials. Now let's make a plan. How do we transition? Which ones are we never going to be able to make if that turns off? And so alongside agriculture, food, energy, and we haven't really got the time to go into them, but it's these honest debates about planting trees versus restoring peatlands, for example. Restoration is better than restarting, okay, hands down. But actually, you can get far more out of re-wetting peatlands than you can planting trees. Mangroves, the importance of those within the ecosystem, and also this whole thing about China's to blame, right? China's not to blame. You have to look at historical emissions. You have to add all of that up. And okay, the government might say here in the UK, yeah, we've reduced our emissions by 30%. Well, yeah, that's because we've exported our emissions in terms of production and supply chain. And you don't include Drax. The huge biomass station actually is pumping out emissions. So again, we come back to these truthful conversations that allow us to go, this is what one person says, this is what the other one says. Let's just have an honest chat and then go, right, what's the best way then to come out of that and move forward with a solution that can help us transition to this more equitable, well-being future. And I will be long dead before I ever know the answers to this. And in 7, 10, 15 generations' time, I know that the voice of the people is getting louder, and this is a great opportunity in a very short space of time. I hope I've touched on enough things to create a bit of thought from whale poo to whatever it might be. But I think have the conversation. That's I guess where I'd be.
Wow. Again, that's amazing. Like you said, you definitely touched on so many different elements that are part of the discourse. You know, I was going to ask you, just as one last parting comment, what would be the one thing you want people to take away? For me, it seems that we're at this stage where we have to be having these discussions. Just the mere fact of having these discussions is essential to help us try and find this balance between what is the role of government, where do individual rights come in, and then achieving this kind of equilibrium. So I'm going to throw it back to you before I say thank you for joining us. I'm going to say your one last call to action from the audience and people who may be listening to us.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, for me, it would be think systems change, not climate change. And it would be throw out a myth. Don't ever be afraid to ask, because I guarantee you there is nobody on this planet that knows every sustainable goal or every scope 3 emission. And it's new for everyone. Just ask the questions, talk about it with your family, talk about it with friends, and just keep being that curious child. And eventually you'll get to the right equilibrium. Thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed it, Ian.
This has been great, Rhona. Thanks so much for joining us, and wishing you all the best for the new year. Good luck to all of us as we continue to tackle not just climate change, also biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation. It's all there. We need to be discussing it, and that's what the purpose of this is. So again, thanks again for joining us, Rhona.
Thank you.